Hey guys, Brazzle the Gamer. Today we're going to be doing a new type of video that I've been kicking around an idea for since I did the Aladdin SNES vs. Genesis video a couple months ago. I want to do something where I compare two different ports of a game of the same name. And there are a couple of other shows online that already do that, but I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently, and I'm going to be doing it in a list format. So I'm going to be looking at 10 different things between the two ports that are different, and kind of talk about, you know, what that means to the game, or just how it affects the game, you know, what have you. But today we're going to be looking at a game that I've already reviewed before, and that's Legendary Wings. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've been wanting to play the arcade version of this game since I found out that there was one. I didn't know that there was an arcade version growing up, and when I went to do the review for this almost a year ago, I found out that there was an arcade version of Legendary Wings, and I had no idea about it. And ever since then, I'd been wanting to kind of take a look at it, maybe do a review of it, but I thought, hey, you know what? This is considerably different from the NES version. The ports are pretty different, but they're still obviously the same game, and there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences also. So let's take a look at Legendary Wings, and we'll start with number 10. We're not going to skirt around it. The most noticeable difference between the two versions of Legendary Wings is the graphics. Obviously, the NES version is not going to look quite as good as the arcade version. The one thing that I feel was added to the NES version that helped it was the inclusion of some Egyptian themes, especially in later levels. You'll see different hieroglyphics scattered throughout the backgrounds in the NES version, but not in the arcade version. Additionally, the horizontal scrolling areas at the end of each stage are much more detailed and interesting in the NES version, where they look pretty much all the same in the arcade. Even though the arcade version is technically superior in this department, I'm still partial to the NES version. All the additional colors of the arcade version still don't add as much to the overall atmosphere as the changes made to the NES do. That's just my opinion. The original main character of this game is a woman named Michelle Hart. She even appears as a support character in Marvel vs. Capcom, so she has a little bit of a reputation in Japan. They changed this when the game was ported to North America. There are actually two North American English arcade cabinet variants, one with Michelle Hart and one with the unnamed male hero. Player 2's name in Michelle Hart's version is Kevin Walker. My guess as to why Capcom went with the unnamed male heroes in the NES port is due to memory constraints. They didn't want to use a different sprite slot for two different playable characters when they could just swap palettes. This isn't a big difference between the two versions, but the NES version of the game swapped the music of levels 2 and 3. Not sure why this would have been done, but I think the music choice in the NES makes more sense atmospherically. The NES level 2 music just sounds like a water level. I guess I can also mention that the arcade's version of the music sounds a bit better, and you don't have the sound channels drop out when you're firing, which is very nice. The reason I like Legendary Wings for the NES so much is that it's challenging, but not kick you in the crotch difficult like so many other shooters from this era are. If you take a hit, you only lose one level of power-up, and you will only lose a life if you get hit on your lowest power-up level. You can easily gain your power-ups back if you lose one or two. It's a very good balance that I absolutely adore. The arcade version is a lot harder. If you get hit, you die and lose a life. No bumping back a power-up. You die, you lose it all. Now, playing with the arcade ROM, there were dip switches that changed the level of difficulty and number of lives. But even in messing with those, I didn't really find the difficulty sweet spot that the NES has. While we're on the topic of difficulty, the NES game may be better balanced and easier overall, but the bosses in the arcade version are a joke. The challenge from the arcade game comes from everything but the bosses. If you have a fully power-up character in the arcade version of Legendary Wings, expect a quick fight, even at the end of the game. These guys drop in one hit. One hit! Also, the dragon from the end of the vertical scrolling portion of the level is not present in the arcade version. The NES has more difficult bosses and even an actual end boss. The NES boss battles just feel more like boss battles should. As you've probably noticed while watching the footage up to this point, the power-up weapons are almost entirely different between the two versions of Legendary Wings. In the NES version, you start with a single shot, upgrade to a twin laser, a flamethrower-looking weapon, this beach ball-looking thing, then the Phoenix Firebird, whatever this is, that kicks ass. In the arcade version, you start with a single shot, upgrade to a double shot, then a three-way shot, and finally a big shot. I just like the NES version more because the weapons all look and act differently and give you a little bit more versatility. The arcade version weapons are just kind of bland by comparison. The NES version is also a lot more liberal with power-ups, and you'll find them flying across stages or scattered throughout the side-scrolling areas. The arcade version requires you to bomb certain areas of the map to upgrade, and they are few and far between and make it much more difficult. The side-scrolling areas are completely different between the two games. In the NES version, you move to a horizontal shooter-type stage, where the arcade version has some very basic platforming elements, like jumping over obstacles and pits. I think both are interesting and fun to play through, but the NES offers different level designs where the arcade version is mostly the same throughout each level, with obstacles placed in only slightly different locations. The roster of enemies are different across both games. There are some enemies that are pretty much exactly the same between both versions, such as these circling enemies at the beginning of the game, or these other enemies that kind of try to dive bomb you. Then you have enemies that are kind of similar, but not quite the same. The big rock statues in the NES game launch their heads at you, but in the arcade game they only launch their fists at you, and that's just not as hardcore in my opinion. And in the enemies that are completely not the same department, the side-scrolling area enemies, absolutely 100% completely different between the two platforms. Lastly, the bombable enemies are pretty lacking in the NES version. You only get to shoot at these anti-aircraft platforms, and the gargoyles at the end of the stage with your bombs. In the arcade version, you get to bomb down the anti-aircraft platforms, but also stuff like giant snake statues that shoot at you. There are danger and lucky side-scrolling areas in both games. The danger areas have kind of already been shown in previous points, but the lucky bonus areas are entirely different between the two platforms. First of all, in the NES version, you bomb an anti-aircraft platform that looks exactly like every other one that you've come across to access the bonus stage. It's a little more hidden and hard to find. In the arcade version, you have to bomb the correct statue near the end of each level. Both versions give you the opportunity to fly in a horizontal stage and collect treasures, but the themes are completely different. The arcade version is a cave, and the treasures are little treasure chests that you can actually destroy with your weapon if you don't collect them properly. In the NES version, the bonus stage is themed after an Egyptian pyramid or treasure room. The treasures are all golden hieroglyphs, and the music is very stylized. Last up, we have level transitions. These are mostly just minor cosmetic differences between the games that don't really make or break either version. In the arcade version, when you enter a lucky, danger, or end stage area, your character flies in from a tube and exits using another tube at the end of the stage. The NES version just fades in and out. Also, at the beginning of each new level in the arcade version, the characters run and leap into the air off of a cliff to start flying. Nothing major. That's all I've got. I'm glad I finally played through the arcade version of Legendary Wings, but I'm still a bigger fan of the NES version. The arcade version was just too hard by comparison and not as enjoyable. Have you played both? Let me know which one you prefer.